Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight, we will talk about something mysterious, something that touches both philosophy and science, and something that raises one of the deepest questions we can ever ask: the nothingness before you were born, before your very first moment, before your first breath, before your first cry. Where were you? What were you? Was there a version of you waiting somewhere, or was it simply nothing? Tonight, we'll explore this question in depth, drawing from physics, biology, philosophy, and ancient wisdom. It will be a journey into the space before your life began. Before we start, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? I love imagining the wide range of people all across the world sharing this moment together. Whether it's evening, late at night, or early in the morning, I invite you to settle in as we begin. When you think about life, it feels natural to anchor yourself in the time you've been alive. Your memories, your thoughts, your sense of identity, all of it exists within the span of your birth until now. Yet this is just a small segment of the full story. You were born into a universe that was already almost 14 billion years old. Before you, entire civilizations rose and fell. Stars were born and died. Galaxies collided, and the Earth spun through countless days and nights. When you ask, where was I before I was born? The answer seems at first obvious. You were nowhere. You didn't exist. But is that really true? Can a person really come from nothing at all? Philosophers have long been fascinated with this question. One way they've framed it is through what's called the symmetry argument. The idea is simple. If you think about death, you may fear it because it feels like a loss of your existence. But the philosopher Epicurus pointed out something intriguing. He said that the infinite stretch of time before your birth was also a state in which you did not exist. Yet you don't feel disturbed about not existing before you were born. If you can accept that state, why should you fear the state after death? Birth and death, in this sense, are symmetrical. You come into being, live for a while, then cease to exist, just as you did not exist before. This raises another question. If you weren't conscious before you were born, does that mean your existence was literally nothing? Or was there a kind of hidden prelude, a state of potential, waiting for the conditions of your birth? Let's think about what makes you in the first place. You're made of atoms: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. None of those atoms were created when you were born. They already existed for billions of years. The oxygen atoms in your lungs, the carbon atoms in your muscles, the calcium atoms in your bones. Those were forged long ago inside the cores of stars. So in one sense, you existed before you were born, just not as a person. You were stardust, scattered across the cosmos, waiting to be assembled into the living organism that is you. There's a strange comfort in that idea. Before you were born, you were not nothing. You were part of the great cycle of matter and energy. You may not have had thoughts or memories, but your ingredients were already here. Physics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. So the energy that now fuels your body, that powers your neurons and generates your consciousness, has always existed in some form. Before it was you, it was sunlight, it was chemical energy, it was particles moving through the Earth's environment. This gives us a different perspective. Maybe the nothingness before birth wasn't absolute nothing. It was simply the absence of your consciousness, even though your physical components already existed. Still, consciousness feels like the core of the question. Atoms and molecules don't worry about existence. consciousness is what makes us care about where we came from and where we're going. So, what about your mind? Neuroscience tells us that consciousness emerges from the brain, from billions of neurons exchanging signals. Before your brain developed, there was no you as a conscious being. You didn't have awareness, thoughts, or feelings. You were not yet a subject experiencing the world. In that sense, before birth, there was indeed nothingness, not in a physical sense, but in the sense of experience. It was like a state of dreamless sleep, but stretched out into eternity. A place outside of time, because without consciousness, time doesn't register. From your perspective, there was no waiting, no boredom, no anticipation. It was as if the universe simply fast-forwarded until the moment you opened your eyes. And yet even here, the question deepens. How is it that you, specifically you, became the conscious being that you are? There were billions of other possible people who could have been born instead of you. Different sperm, different egg, different combinations of DNA. Out of an unimaginably vast number of potential humans, you are the one that appeared. Before you, there was a wide horizon of possibilities, and only one collapsed into reality. Some thinkers compare this to quantum physics, where particles exist as probabilities until they are observed, at which point they collapse into a definite state. Could it be that you were once a kind of probability, a potential existence, waiting to become actual? There's also the question of identity. When you say, "Where was I before I was born?" you're assuming that the I is something continuous, like a soul or an essence. But maybe that assumption isn't quite right. Maybe there wasn't an I at all before your brain developed. Instead, the I is a construct that began only once your brain became complex enough to generate a sense of self. From that point of view, asking, "Where was I before I was born?" is a little like asking, "Where was the flame before the match was lit?" The flame didn't exist yet, and the question only makes sense once the right conditions are met. On the other hand, some traditions suggest that consciousness doesn't start or end with physical life. Many cultures have believed in a soul that exists before birth and continues after death. In Hinduism, for example, the soul is said to be eternal, cycling through different lives in the process of reincarnation. In certain forms of Western philosophy, such as Plato's, the soul exists before birth in a realm of pure truth and knowledge, and entering the body is like forgetting what it once knew. These ideas are not scientific in the modern sense, but they reflect humanity's deep intuition that consciousness might be more than just a temporary flicker. If consciousness does transcend the body, then perhaps you did exist in some form before birth, just not in a way that you can currently remember. Memory itself complicates things. The reason you can't recall anything from before you were born is that memory requires a functioning brain, and your brain wasn't developed until late in your gestation. In fact, even as a baby, memory takes time to form. That's why most people don't remember anything from the first few years of life. This is called infantile amnesia. In that sense, even after birth, you pass through a period of near nothingness, where you experienced but didn't retain those moments. The difference is that at least during infancy, you were alive and responding to the world, even if your memory wasn't recording it. Before birth, there was no you to record anything at all. When we think about nothingness, it's actually hard to truly imagine. The human mind is not built to picture the absence of everything. When you try to imagine nothingness, you might picture blackness or emptiness or silence, but those are still somethings. Black is still a colour. Silence is still an experience. True nothingness has no space, no time, no feeling, no perception. It isn't even darkness. It's beyond description. That's what makes the nothingness before birth so mysterious. You didn't notice it because there was no you to notice. And yet somehow, from that nothingness, here you are. This brings us back to the strange asymmetry of experience. From your perspective, life has always existed. You open your eyes and the world is here. You can think about death or pre-birth nothingness, but you can't experience them directly. They're outside the scope of your awareness, which means that, for you, existence begins with your first memory and extends until your last. Everything before and after might as well not exist at all, because it's inaccessible, and yet it does exist. Or rather, it did. The world went on before you, and it will go on after. That's the tension. You are both incredibly significant to yourself, and yet just a brief moment in a universe that stretches across billions of years. In this way, asking about where you were before you were born becomes less about a literal location and more about the boundaries of identity, time, and consciousness. It's about trying to picture something our minds aren't designed to hold, and perhaps that's what makes the question so powerful. It forces us to confront the edges of what it means to be. Before exploring the nothingness before birth, it helps to understand just how much of you was already in motion long before your first moment. When you think about yourself, you probably imagine your mind, your memories, your body, the very things that didn't exist yet. But what if the deeper truth is that you have always existed in some form? Not as a person, but as matter, energy, and possibility. The nothingness is not absolute. It is framed by a universe that was already moving forward, already building the conditions for you. Let's start with matter. The atoms that make up your body are unimaginably old. Most of the hydrogen in your body is as ancient as the universe itself, formed just minutes after the Big Bang nearly 14 billion years ago. The carbon that forms your DNA, the oxygen you breathe, the calcium in your bones, all of these were forged inside stars that lived and died long before the Earth even existed. When massive stars reached the end of their lifespans, they exploded in supernovas, scattering the elements into space. Those atoms drifted for eons, eventually coming together in clouds of dust and gas that formed our solar system. From that, the Earth was born, and much later, so were you. In a literal sense, before you were a person, you were a star. And before that, you were the energy of the Big Bang itself. When you say, "I didn't exist before birth," that's only partially true. Your consciousness didn't, but your physical building blocks did. It's strange to think that long before you were alive, your atoms were parts of countless other systems. Maybe some of the carbon that makes up your brain once formed part of a leaf, or a fish, or even another human. The oxygen in your lungs may have been breathed by ancient animals millions of years ago. Matter is recycled endlessly. In fact, there's a good chance you are carrying atoms that once belonged to people who lived thousands of years before you. In this way, you were already here, scattered across the world, participating in a story much larger than yourself. But matter alone doesn't explain you. You are not just atoms, you are an organized pattern. Consciousness arises not from the mere presence of molecules, but from their incredibly precise arrangement. That arrangement was not guaranteed. It required a long chain of events. Your parents meeting, their ancestors before them, and on and on. Each step in that chain was filled with contingency, with chance. From this perspective, you are not just matter, you are probability. You are a possibility that existed long before you were actualized. Think about it like this. Before you were born, there were infinite possible people who could have been born instead. Different combinations of sperm and egg, different decisions made by your ancestors, different twists of fate. Yet out of that vast field of possibilities, you are the one that came into being. This is sometimes described as the lottery of existence. Before birth, you were one possibility among countless others. You did not exist in actuality, but you existed in potential. Quantum physics gives us an interesting metaphor for this. In the quantum world, particles do not exist in definite states until they are measured. Instead, they exist as probabilities spread out in a wave of possibilities. Only when observed do they collapse into one outcome. You could think of your existence in a similar way. Before you were born, you were like a quantum possibility, a wave of potential selves. Once the conditions aligned, that wave collapsed into you, the conscious being listening right now. This view blends science with philosophy. On one hand, it reminds us that we are not separate from the universe. We are its expression. On the other hand, it raises the question of identity. If you were once just probability, then what makes you uniquely you? Was there always something distinct about your potential, or was your existence purely the result of chance? Some philosophers have argued that identity is not a fixed thing, but an emergent property. You did not exist before birth in the sense of having a stable identity, but the potential for your identity was already there, encoded in DNA, waiting to be expressed. In this sense, the nothingness before birth is less about absence and more about dormancy. It is like the way a seed contains the potential for a tree, even before it grows. The seed is not yet a tree, but it is not nothing. Similarly, you before birth were not yet a person, but you are not nothing either. At the same time, there is a deeper nothingness that cannot be ignored. Consciousness itself, your awareness, your inner world, did not exist yet. And from your perspective, this is the most significant absence. Because what defines your reality is not just that atoms exist or that probabilities unfold, but that you are aware of them. Without awareness, the universe might as well not exist at all, at least from your point of view. So the nothingness before birth was not a physical nothingness, but a subjective one. It was the absence of experience, and that absence was complete. This absence has been compared to dreamless sleep. When you are in deep, dreamless sleep, there is no sense of self, no awareness of time, no memory of anything happening. Hours pass, but from your perspective, it feels instantaneous. When you wake up, it's as if no time has passed at all. The nothingness before birth is like that, but stretched across eternity. You did not experience waiting. You did not notice billions of years pass. You simply weren't there. And when you finally came into being, it was as if the universe had been holding its breath, waiting for you to arrive. And yet you weren't exactly absent from the universe. The cosmos carried on, filled with stars, planets, and life. History unfolded without you, but in another sense, it was preparing for you. Every event that happened before your birth was part of the chain that led to your existence. If even one link in that chain had broken, you might not be here. The wars fought by your ancestors, the migrations, the chance encounters, the survival of one lineage over another. all of it shaped the conditions that led to you. In this way, the nothingness before birth is entangled with everything. You may not have been conscious, but the world was moving toward you all along. This is a paradox. On one hand, you did not exist, and the universe got along fine without you. On the other hand, the universe was building toward your existence all the while. You were absent, and yet you were always implied. That tension is what makes the question so fascinating. It forces us to consider not only what existence is, but what it means to not exist. Some philosophers suggest that nothingness is not a real state. They argue that even before you were born, there was always something: atoms, energy, probability, the conditions of life. Absolute nothingness, they claim, is impossible. The universe does not allow it. From this perspective, the nothingness before birth is an illusion. You were not conscious, but you were still part of reality in some form. You were never truly absent, only unformed. Others take a stricter view. They say that consciousness is the only measure of existence that matters. Without awareness, you did not exist, no matter what your atoms were doing. From this angle, the nothingness before birth was absolute in the only sense that counts. It was the complete absence of subjectivity. There was no observer, no experiencer, no inner world. You didn't exist at all, and then suddenly you did. Both perspectives have weight. One emphasizes continuity, the way you were always part of the universe's ongoing story. The other emphasizes discontinuity, the sheer miracle of a new consciousness appearing where there was none before. Taken together, they suggest that you are both eternal and fleeting. Eternal as matter, energy, and probability. Fleeting as an individual consciousness that begins and ends in time. This duality also invites us to think about death. If the nothingness before birth and the nothingness after death are symmetrical, then perhaps death is not something to fear. Just as you were not disturbed by the billions of years before you existed, you will not be disturbed by the billions of years after you are gone. Nothingness from the inside is not frightening. It is simply nothing at all. And yet we do not live as pure matter or as pure probability. We live as conscious beings, asking questions, seeking meaning, marveling at our brief window of awareness. That is what makes the question of pre-birth nothingness so haunting. It is not only about what was, but about what it means that there was ever anything at all. Why should consciousness emerge out of non-conscious matter? Why should there be something rather than nothing? And why, out of all the possible someones, should that something be you? These questions do not have simple answers, but they open the door to deeper understanding. They remind us that existence itself is extraordinary. You emerged from a universe that seemed not to need you, and yet here you are, able to think, to wonder, to ask where you were before you were born. When we think about the nothingness before birth, one of the most puzzling aspects is time. Time is everywhere in your life. You measure it, worry about it, celebrate it, and feel it passing. But before you were born, time passed without you. Billions of years unfolded, yet from your perspective, it was instantaneous. This raises an interesting puzzle. What is the meaning of time when there is no consciousness to perceive it? Physics tells us that time is a dimension, woven together with space into what we call space-time. Just as space exists whether or not you're walking through it, time continues whether or not you're experiencing it. Before you were born, time was moving forward, the earth was spinning, the seasons were cycling, and life was evolving. But from your perspective, there was no perception of waiting, no sense of anticipation, no passage at all. It was not even like sleep, because in sleep you can be woken up. It was a kind of timeless void, a gap in personal reality. To imagine this, consider what happens during deep, dreamless sleep. Hours can pass, but from your point of view, it feels like no time at all. You close your eyes, and the next moment you're waking up. The time in between seems to vanish. The nothingness before birth is like this on an infinite scale. It doesn't matter whether it was 1,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years. You didn't notice it because there was no you to notice. The entire span of cosmic history before your birth was compressed into nothing from your point of view. It was as if the universe fast-forwarded until the moment you arrived. This raises a strange but profound realization. Subjectivity defines your experience of time. Without awareness, time is irrelevant. You didn't wait through the billions of years before your birth. They simply weren't part of your reality. In a way, the universe was always waiting for you, not in a conscious sense, but in the sense that your existence only begins when you appear. Time before that is real in a cosmic sense, but not in a personal one. This leads to a bigger question. Is existence defined by the universe itself, or by the consciousness that observes it? On one hand, the universe clearly exists without us. Stars formed long before humans were around to look at them. Dinosaurs roamed the earth millions of years before we arrived. On the other hand, from your perspective, reality only begins when you appear. Before you were conscious, there was no you to confirm or deny anything. Philosophers sometimes call this the problem of subjectivity. Reality exists independently, but your personal reality only begins with your awareness. This brings us to the nature of consciousness itself. Neuroscience suggests that consciousness emerges from complex networks of neurons firing in the brain. Your brain is like an orchestra of 86 billion neurons, each sending tiny electrical signals. And somehow, out of that activity, your inner world emerges. Before your brain developed, there was no orchestra, no music. There was no experience at all. From that perspective, asking where was I before I was born is a bit like asking where was the sound before the instrument started playing. The sound didn't exist yet because the conditions for it hadn't been created. But this raises another puzzle. If consciousness emerges only when the brain reaches a certain level of complexity, does that mean you didn't exist at all before your birth? Or were you, in some sense, already implicit in the universe, waiting for the right conditions to appear? One way to think about this is in terms of potential. Before your birth, you didn't exist as an actual conscious being, but the potential for you was already there, encoded in the laws of physics, the unfolding of history, and the biology of your parents. That potential was real, even if you were not. Some thinkers compare this to a flame. Before you light a match, the flame does not exist. And yet, the conditions for the flame are already present. The fuel, the oxygen, the chemical properties that will make combustion possible. When you strike the match, the flame appears, but it was always implicit in the materials. Similarly, before your birth, you were not yet conscious, but the conditions for your existence were building all along. When the right moment arrived, you came into being. This way of thinking reveals something fascinating about identity. You are not separate from the universe. You are one of its expressions, arising when the conditions align. Before birth, you were implicit in the universe, even if you weren't yet aware. In this sense, the nothingness before birth was not pure absence. It was a kind of hidden potential, a seed waiting for the right soil. Still, the subjective side cannot be ignored. From your own point of view, it really was nothingness. There was no awareness, no memory, no perception. And that makes it difficult to even talk about. Human language is designed to describe things, but nothingness is not a thing. When you try to imagine it, you probably picture darkness or emptiness or silence, but those are still experiences. True nothingness is beyond description. It is not even darkness, because darkness is something you can see. It is not even silence, because silence is something you can hear. Nothingness before birth is not like looking at a blank screen. It is the absence of the screen itself. This is why philosophers and mystics alike have struggled with the concept of nothingness. Some traditions embrace it, seeing it as the origin of all things. In Taoism, the Tao is described as the void from which everything arises. In Buddhism, the idea of emptiness is central, not as a terrifying absence, but as the true nature of reality, which is interdependent and without fixed essence. From these perspectives, the nothingness before birth is not something to fear, but something to understand. It is the fertile ground from which being emerges. Science also approaches the question in its own way. Cosmology tells us that the universe itself may have emerged from a kind of nothing. The Big Bang was not an explosion in space. It was the creation of space and time themselves. Before it, there may not have been anything at all, or, depending on the theory, there may have been a quantum vacuum, a seething field of energy from which the universe appeared. Either way, it challenges our idea of nothingness. Perhaps what we call nothing is never truly nothing, but always some kind of potential waiting to unfold. If that's true, then the nothingness before your birth may be less absolute than it feels. You did not exist as a conscious being, but the universe contained the potential for you. You were implicit in the unfolding of events, written into the probabilities of existence. And when the conditions were right, you emerged. From this perspective, you are not something separate from the cosmos. You are the cosmos becoming aware of itself for a brief time through you. Yet even with this understanding, the strangeness remains. Why should there be consciousness at all? Why should the universe produce beings capable of asking, "Where was I before I was born?" This is one of the deepest mysteries of all. Some scientists call it the hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. We can describe the firing of neurons, the flow of electricity, the chemistry of synapses, but none of that explains why it feels like something to be you. Before your birth, none of that existed, then suddenly it did, and with it came the world as you know it. The leap from nothingness to awareness is astonishing. It reminds us that existence is not just about being made of atoms, but about having an inner world. You did not exist until the inner world appeared, and yet now that it has, you can look back and wonder about the void before. That in itself is remarkable. The nothingness before birth, then, is not just a curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility and wonder of existence. It shows you that your awareness is not inevitable, not guaranteed. It is a fleeting spark in a vast darkness, and precisely because it is fleeting, it is precious. If we want to understand the nothingness before birth, it helps to look closely at how existence begins, not in a cosmic sense, but in a biological one. Consciousness is not something that appears all at once. It emerges gradually through the development of your body and brain. And by following that development, we can see the delicate boundary between nothingness and being. It begins with two cells, a sperm and an egg. Each carries half of the genetic information needed to make a human being. On their own, they are alive, but they are not you. They are simply cells, like countless others. Yet when they combine, something extraordinary happens. The two sets of DNA merge, creating a unique blueprint. That single cell divides, then divides again, and soon a tiny cluster of cells begins to grow. At this stage, you still don't exist as a conscious being. You are a biological process unfolding according to chemistry and physics. Over time, those cells specialize. Some become muscle, some bone, some skin. Others become neurons, the building blocks of the brain. The brain is the key because without it, there is no consciousness. Early in development, the brain is just a simple structure. It cannot yet generate awareness. But as weeks pass, neurons multiply, forming networks, sending signals. Slowly, the architecture of a mind takes shape. This gradual emergence challenges the idea of a sharp boundary between nothingness and existence. There is no single moment when you suddenly appear. Instead, there is a continuous process of becoming. At first, you are not conscious. Then you begin to respond to stimuli. Later, faint glimmers of awareness may arise, though not in any way you would remember. By the time you are born, the foundations of consciousness are in place. But even then, you are not the you know today. Infants live in a haze of sensation, without the structured self-awareness of adults. In a sense, you are still emerging from nothingness even after birth. This gradual process also raises questions about identity. If you ask, "Where was I before I was born?" you might assume there is a clear line. Before that point, you were nothing. After that point, you were you. But biology shows that the line is blurred. You didn't suddenly appear at birth. You developed slowly, step by step, out of a sequence of processes stretching back into deep time. Before you, there was your genetic code, passed down through generations. Before that, there was life itself, evolving over billions of years. Before that, there were the molecules that would one day form life. Where exactly in that chain did you begin? From a scientific perspective, you did not exist until your brain was developed enough to generate consciousness. But even then, consciousness is not a switch that flips on. It grows gradually. This suggests that the nothingness before birth is not a simple state. It is a spectrum, a slow unfolding of being from non-being. This raises profound philosophical questions. If you didn't exist before consciousness, why should you care about that time? From your perspective, it was nothing. Yet, from another point of view, your existence was already implicit in the processes leading to you. The DNA was there, the conditions were in place. You were not yet conscious, but you were on the way. Does that mean you existed in potential, even if not in actuality? This idea of potential is central to understanding pre-birth nothingness. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, spoke of the difference between potentiality and actuality. A block of marble has the potential to be a statue, but it is not yet one until the sculptor shapes it. Before birth, you were like that block of marble, filled with potential, but not yet actualized. Once the right conditions aligned, the potential became reality. But unlike marble, the potential for you was incredibly specific. Out of all the possible genetic combinations, only one produced you. The chance that you exist is astronomically small. If a different sperm had reached the egg, you would not be here. If an ancestor in your family tree had made a different choice centuries ago, you would not exist. Your presence in the universe is the outcome of countless fragile contingencies. Before birth, you were not inevitable. You were one possibility among billions. This makes the nothingness before birth feel even more mysterious. It is not just that you didn't exist, it's that you so easily might never have existed at all. The universe could have unfolded in countless other ways, and you would never have appeared. From this perspective, the fact that you are here, asking about pre-birth nothingness, is nothing short of astonishing. Biology also shows us that consciousness is not just a matter of having a brain, but of having the right kind of experiences. Babies are born with brains ready to learn, but without interaction with the world, the mind cannot fully develop. This means that even after birth, you are still emerging from nothingness in a way. Your selfhood was not complete until you formed memories, language, and identity. Before that, you were alive, but not yet the you recognize today. This gradual process also raises questions about what it means to be a self. If you did not exist before birth, and if even after birth it took years for you to fully form, then the self may not be as solid as it seems. It may be more like a story, assembled from experiences, memories, and social interactions. Before birth, there was no story. After birth, the story began to write itself. You were both the author and the character, emerging from the blank page of nothingness. Some philosophers and neuroscientists argue that the self is not a thing at all, but a process. From this perspective, the nothingness before birth is simply the absence of that process. You didn't exist because the story hadn't started. Once the story began, it created the illusion of a continuous identity, stretching back through memory. But memory only goes so far. Beyond it lies nothing. This process view also helps explain why death feels so similar to pre-birth nothingness. When the brain stops functioning, the process of consciousness ends. Just as it began gradually before birth, it ends gradually at death. The symmetry is striking. Before birth, nothing. After death, nothing. In between, a brief window of awareness. From that perspective, your life is like a candle flame, not eternal, but real while it burns. And yet, even in this biological view, there is room for wonder. The fact that consciousness arises at all is still unexplained. How can matter produce awareness? How can neurons give rise to thoughts, feelings, and a sense of self? This remains one of the deepest mysteries in science. Before you were born, that mystery had not yet taken shape in your body, but the potential was there, waiting. So when you ask, where was I before I was born? Biology gives a clear but incomplete answer. You were nowhere as a conscious being. You didn't exist yet, but you were also everywhere, scattered across atoms, encoded in probabilities, waiting in potential. You were both absent and implied, nothing and yet something. This paradox is part of what makes the question so haunting. It reminds you that your existence is not a given. It is a fragile, improbable, and miraculous event. The nothingness before birth is not just an absence, it is the backdrop against which the wonder of being shines. When people think about the nothingness before birth, they often feel an unease that is strangely similar to the unease surrounding death. Both are boundaries of consciousness. Both mark the edges of personal experience. And both force us to ask the same unsettling question: what is it like to not exist? At first glance, the symmetry seems perfect. Before birth, you did not exist. After death, you will not exist. In both cases, there is an absence of awareness. From your perspective, there is no difference. You cannot experience non-existence. You cannot suffer it. You cannot even perceive it. Consciousness is the only medium through which you know reality, and when consciousness is absent, there is nothing at all. The philosopher Epicurus expressed this idea 2,000 years ago. He argued that death is nothing to us, because where we are, death is not, and where death is, we are not. The same logic applies to pre-birth nothingness. For billions of years before you were born, the universe unfolded without you. Did you suffer in that time? Did you feel deprived? Of course not. You weren't there to feel anything. By the same reasoning, when you die, there will be no you to mourn your absence. This argument can be comforting, but it can also feel alien. If the nothingness before birth was truly symmetrical with the nothingness after death, then why do we fear one but not the other? Few people are troubled by the fact that they didn't exist in the year 1200, but many are terrified by the thought that they won't exist in the year 2200. The difference lies in perspective. You view the past as fixed, distant, and unchangeable. The future, on the other hand, feels like something you are moving toward. The loss of future experiences feels like a deprivation, even if the past is full of experiences you never had. Philosophers call this the asymmetry problem. If pre-birth and post-death nothingness are the same in kind, why should we regard them differently? Some argue that we are biased toward the future because of the way our minds are built. We remember the past, but anticipate the future. Memory gives us no reason to feel deprived about the past we missed, but anticipation makes us yearn for the future we may lose. This is not a rational distinction, but an emotional one. Still, the symmetry is worth reflecting on. Imagine a line stretching infinitely in both directions. Your life is a small segment of that line, a finite interval bounded by two vast expanses of nothingness. The nothingness before birth and after death are not two different things. They are the same endless absence pressing in from both sides. Your existence is like a flicker, a brief disturbance in the void. For most of eternity, you are not here. This perspective can be unsettling, but it can also inspire gratitude. The fact that you exist at all, even for a short time, is extraordinary. Out of infinite nothingness, there is a moment of something. The odds against this happening are immense. You could just as easily have never existed, and in fact, almost all possible combinations of circumstances would have led to your non-existence. The universe could have been without you forever, but it isn't. For this brief window, you are here. Cultures throughout history have grappled with this symmetry in different ways. In ancient Egypt, life was seen as a preparation for death, which was imagined as a continuation of existence in another realm. For them, the boundary after life was not nothingness but transition. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, life and death are part of a cycle of rebirth. In this view, there is no absolute nothingness before or after. Existence continues, taking different forms shaped by karma and cosmic law. The idea of pre-birth nothingness is replaced with pre-birth existence, stretching back through countless lives. In contrast, modern secular thought tends to emphasize the naturalistic view. Before you were born, you did not exist. After you die, you will not exist. The symmetry is stark. This view is consistent with what science tells us, but it leaves many searching for deeper meaning. If your existence is bracketed by nothingness, does that mean life itself is meaningless? Or does it mean that life is more precious precisely because it is rare and temporary? Some thinkers have argued that the awareness of nothingness can actually enhance meaning. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger suggested that our confrontation with death forces us to live authentically. Knowing that life is finite compels us to make choices, to take responsibility for the time we have. Similarly, reflecting on the nothingness before birth can remind us that our existence is not guaranteed. We are not owed this moment, it is a gift, however brief. From a scientific standpoint, the symmetry also raises fascinating questions about consciousness itself. Why does consciousness exist only in a narrow window of time? Why does it emerge at all? If matter can generate awareness, why doesn't it persist forever? Neuroscience shows us that consciousness depends on the functioning of the brain. When the brain forms, consciousness appears. When the brain ceases, consciousness disappears. From this perspective, the nothingness before birth and after death are not mysterious at all. They are simply what happens when the conditions for consciousness are absent. But this explanation leaves us with an even deeper mystery. Why should there be consciousness in the first place? Why should the universe contain beings who can experience it at all? Matter could just as easily have remained unconscious, lifeless, inert. And yet here you are, able to reflect on your own beginnings and endings. This fact alone adds weight to the question of nothingness. Consider for a moment how unlikely your life is. The number of ancestors required for you to exist doubles each generation. In 10 generations, you have over 1,000 ancestors. In 20 generations, over 1 million. Each of those people had to survive long enough to reproduce, had to meet the right person at the right time, had to make choices that led to your eventual existence. If even one link in that chain had broken, you would not be here. Before birth, you were balanced on a knife's edge between existence and nothingness. This precariousness mirrors the fragility of life itself. Just as you so easily might not have existed, you can also so easily cease to exist. Life depends on delicate conditions: oxygen, food, safety, health. Without them, the window of consciousness closes. This fragility is not cause for despair. It is cause for awe. Against all odds, here you are, experiencing this moment. The symmetry of pre-birth and post-death nothingness can also shift how we think about time. We usually imagine time as flowing from past to future, with our life as one section along the stream. But from another perspective, time may be less like a flow and more like a landscape. Your life is one stretch of that landscape, bounded by absence on both sides. From this view, the nothingness before and after are simply parts of the terrain. They frame your existence, but do not diminish it. This framing leads to a profound realization. Non-existence is not something to fear, because it is not something you can ever experience. It is not an event in your life. It is the absence of your life altogether. Just as you did not miss anything before you were born, you will not miss anything after you die. The only time that matters, the only time you will ever have, is now. So when you think about the nothingness before birth, you are not just reflecting on the past. You are glimpsing the larger structure of existence. You are recognizing that life is a finite interval, a spark in the dark. And in doing so, you are reminded that the spark itself is extraordinary. When you think about what existed before you were born, the instinctive answer is simple: nothing. For you, there was no awareness, no memory, no existence. But if we take science seriously, the question becomes more complicated. What does before really mean in the context of time? Is there truly a before your existence, or is that just a limitation of how we perceive reality? Albert Einstein's theory of relativity forces us to rethink time itself. In everyday life, we treat time as a flowing river, with a past behind us, a present we're in now, and a future ahead. But according to relativity, time is not an independent flow. It is bound up with space, forming a four-dimensional fabric called space-time. In this framework, past, present, and future all coexist as parts of the structure. From a space-time perspective, your life is not something moving along a line, but a complete block. A world line stretching from your birth to your death. Everything outside those boundaries exists as well, just not accessible to your personal consciousness. This leads to the idea of the block universe. In the block universe, all moments in time exist equally, the way all places exist equally in space. You may experience time as flowing, but that flow is an illusion of consciousness. In this view, your pre-birth nothingness isn't really a void. It's simply the part of space-time where your world line does not exist. Your birth is the point where your line begins. Your death is where it ends. And everything outside that segment is still real, just not part of your existence. This perspective changes how we see the nothingness before birth. It's not a mysterious abyss, but rather the absence of you in a region of the universe's timeline. Imagine a long film reel. Your life is one short scene within it. The frames before your entrance don't contain you, but they are still there. From this view, the universe before your birth wasn't nothing at all. Stars burned, oceans rose and fell, civilizations lived and died. It was only nothing to you, because you had not yet entered the real. Quantum physics adds another layer of strangeness. At the quantum level, reality is probabilistic, not deterministic. Events are not fixed until they happen. They exist as probabilities, as superpositions. Some interpretations suggest that every possible outcome actually exists, branching into multiple worlds. If that's the case, then the before of your birth might not be a fixed absence. It could be one of many possible quantum histories, some of which led to you, others of which did not. Your existence might be the result of a vast branching process, where countless paths led to countless outcomes, only one of which included the conditions necessary for your particular consciousness. This raises a startling possibility. Your pre-birth nothingness may not have been nothing at all, but rather a superposition of possibilities, most of which never became you. In other words, you emerged not out of an absolute void, but out of a tangled network of quantum chance. You are here because one particular branch of probability unfolded in just the right way. Cosmology complicates the picture even further. If the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang, then time itself had a beginning. Asking what happened before the Big Bang may not even make sense, because time did not exist in that context. In the same way, asking where you were before you were born might be asking the wrong kind of question. Before is a concept that applies to time, but your existence begins only once certain conditions arise. For you, there is no before, because before requires a subject to experience it. But cosmologists don't agree on whether time had a beginning. Some models suggest that the universe could be part of a larger multiverse, with countless other universes expanding, collapsing, and giving rise to new ones. In such a model, the universe you were born into is just one bubble in an endless sea of bubbles. In that vast cosmic context, your pre-birth nothingness might not have been nothing at all. It might have been simply being absent from other universes, other cosmic cycles, until this particular one gave rise to you. There is also the question of whether time is truly linear at all. In physics, some researchers explore the possibility that time is emergent, not fundamental. In this view, time is not the deepest layer of reality, but something that arises from more basic relationships, perhaps from quantum entanglement or other structures we don't yet fully understand. If time itself is emergent, then the idea of before birth might be a byproduct of how our consciousness interprets reality, not a fundamental truth. You experience a timeline, and therefore you ask what came before you. But the universe may not operate in such a straightforward sequence. There's a fascinating symmetry here with how our brains construct memory. You don't remember anything before your birth, but you also don't remember your early infancy. Does that mean you didn't exist then? Of course not. It means your brain wasn't yet developed enough to form lasting memories. Similarly, asking what you were before you were born might be asking about a state where there is no you to hold memory, no perspective to record experience. It may not be nothing. It may simply be inaccessible. Some scientists and philosophers have pushed this even further. Julian Barber, a physicist, argues that time itself may not exist in the way we think it does. He suggests that the universe is a collection of nows, timeless moments that don't flow but simply exist. In this radical view, your life is not a moving line at all. It is a scattered set of configurations, like snapshots, stitched together by your consciousness into the illusion of continuity. From this perspective, asking what happened before you were born may not have meaning. There is no before. There are only different nows, some of which contain you and some of which do not. This vision echoes some ancient philosophies. In Buddhism, for instance, the self is considered an illusion, a process, not an entity. Consciousness is not a permanent essence, but a stream of moments, each arising and fading. The boundary of birth is just one point in that stream, not a beginning in the absolute sense. Similarly, death is not an absolute end, but a change in the flow. Thinking in these terms, pre-birth nothingness is not a terrifying void, but simply the absence of the conditions that create the moment-to-moment arising of self. Scientific models of time also intersect with personal identity in surprising ways. If time is a block and all moments exist equally, then in a sense you are still a child, still unborn, still every age you have ever been, all at once. You are not just who you are now. You are the entire timeline of your existence. This means that the you who existed before birth is simply no one, because your timeline had not yet begun. But the moment your timeline starts, it exists eternally within the block. You are as permanent as any event in space-time. You cannot reach backward beyond your birth, but your birth itself will always be part of the structure. This leads to an odd conclusion. In a block universe, the pre-birth nothingness is not really gone, because your birth has always existed and always will exist. You cannot access the nothingness, but you also cannot erase the fact that your beginning is etched into space-time. You may have emerged from nothing, but that emergence is permanent in the cosmic record. What emerges from all these scientific perspectives is that the idea of before birth is far less simple than it first seems. Relativity suggests that your non-existence is just absence from space-time regions. Quantum theory suggests you emerged from a field of probabilities. Cosmology suggests your existence depends on the universe's deeper structure, which may itself be infinite or cyclical. And some theories suggest that time itself may not even exist in the way we imagine, meaning that before is an illusion. What all these views share is a challenge to the instinctive picture of nothingness. To you, it feels like there was nothing before you were born, but science suggests that the universe has always been full of matter, energy, quantum fields, even entire other universes. It was only nothing to you. The absence was personal, not cosmic. And in that recognition lies a profound insight. The nothingness you fear may never have been real in the first place. Across human history, cultures have tried to imagine what existed before a person's birth. Was it a void, a waiting place, a cycle of rebirth, or something completely beyond words? While modern science offers us relativity, quantum fields, and cosmology, ancient and spiritual traditions offer equally rich frameworks, mythological, symbolic, and deeply human. These traditions reveal not just speculation about existence, but also humanity's longing for meaning. One of the most widespread ideas is reincarnation. In Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and certain strands of other spiritual philosophies, the self is thought to cycle through many lives. What you were before this life was not nothingness, but another being, perhaps human, perhaps not, shaped by the law of karma. Karma is not simply reward or punishment, but the natural unfolding of causes and conditions. Every action plants seeds that sprout in future existences. In this worldview, your birth was not the start of you, but a continuation. The body and personality you have now are temporary forms, but the stream of consciousness flows on. In Hindu thought, some schools describe a vast cosmic soul, the Atman, which is eternal and identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality. From this perspective, before your birth, you were never truly absent. You were always part of the eternal essence, temporarily localized into a body during life. Your before is simply your unmanifested state. When you ask, "What was I before I was born?" the answer is, you were pure being, undifferentiated from the ultimate source. Buddhism frames the idea differently. While it accepts rebirth, it denies a permanent self that travels from life to life. Instead, it describes a chain of dependent origination, where consciousness arises again and again due to conditions. You are like a flame lighting another flame, not identical, not separate, but connected. In this way, what you were before you were born is not a single essence waiting somewhere, but the continuation of a process, the unfolding of cause and effect. From this view, your nothingness before birth is not empty, but filled with the momentum of countless prior lives. Other cultures hold very different visions. In ancient Greek philosophy, Plato suggested that souls pre-existed before birth. In his dialogue, Meno, he describes learning as a form of recollection, knowledge that the soul already had before entering the body. To Plato, your soul existed in a pure, immaterial realm before birth, contemplating eternal truths. Birth was a kind of forgetting, a plunge into the physical world that obscured what you once knew. To live wisely was to remember, to glimpse again the eternal forms. In this sense, your pre-birth existence was more real than your life now. This world is the shadow, and before birth, you were closer to the truth. Christian traditions also wrestle with the question. Most mainstream Christian theology teaches that the soul is created at conception, meaning there is no pre-birth existence. You were not waiting anywhere before being born. Your soul began when your life began. But there have been exceptions. Early Christian thinkers, like Origen, speculated that souls pre-existed in a divine realm before descending into bodies. Although this idea was later rejected as heresy, it shows that the question of pre-birth identity has always been alive, even within traditions that deny it. Judaism too contains echoes of pre-birth existence. Some mystical traditions suggest that souls exist in a heavenly treasury before being born. The Talmud speaks of an angel teaching unborn children the secrets of the Torah, which they forget upon birth. In this vision, before you were born, you were not nothing. You were already a soul, already learning, already part of a hidden cosmic order. Your birth was not the beginning, but a forgetting, a veil placed over your deeper knowledge. In indigenous cultures across the world, there are countless other visions. The Maori of New Zealand describe life as part of a continuous cycle connecting ancestors, the living, and those yet to be born. In this worldview, before you were born, you were with the ancestors, part of the lineage that carries life forward. Among certain Native American traditions, souls are thought to emerge from the spirit world when the time is right, joining the physical world through birth. The line between life, death, and pre-life is porous. Existence moves fluidly across states. In ancient Mesopotamia, some texts suggest that souls existed in a kind of underworld or shadowy place before birth, and returned there after death. This continuity paints birth not as a sudden creation, but as a transition from one realm to another. Likewise, in ancient Egypt, the concept of the Ka and Ba, different aspects of the soul, suggested a continuity that stretched beyond physical life. The Ba was thought to exist before birth, entering the body at conception, linking the individual to the eternal cycle of gods and ancestors. Even in modern philosophy, echoes of pre-birth existence appear. Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, argued that the essence of our being is the will to live, an eternal striving that manifests through countless forms. What you were before birth, in his view, is not an individual identity, but this universal will, timeless and endless. Nietzsche, too, with his idea of eternal recurrence, hinted at a cyclical universe where your life repeats infinitely. In that framework, before you were born, you had already lived this life and will live it again, endlessly. The most haunting part of these mythologies and philosophies is how they deal with memory. If we truly existed before birth, whether as a soul, a spark of divine essence, or a reincarnated being, why don't we remember it? Nearly every tradition offers an answer. Plato said, "We forget upon entering the body." Buddhism suggests there is no permanent self to remember. Mystical Judaism says an angel erases our memory at birth. Hinduism says karma veils our awareness. Christianity, by rejecting pre-birth entirely, says there is nothing to remember. In every case, the silence of memory is explained not as evidence of nothingness, but as part of the cosmic design. There's also a recurring theme of waiting. Many traditions imagine souls in a pre-birth realm, waiting for the right time to be born. In Hawaiian cosmology, the soul is with the ancestors until the right physical vessel is ready. In Mormon belief, a pre-mortal existence is described, where spirits live with God before birth, learning and preparing for mortal life. In this framework, your life is not a sudden spark out of nothing, but a stage in a much longer story. You were already you, in some form, long before you took on this body. Mythologies also often frame pre-birth existence as symmetrical with death. Just as the soul returns somewhere after death, it must have come from somewhere before birth. The idea that we enter from nothing and return to nothing feels too abrupt for many traditions. Instead, they imagine a cycle, a mirror. Where you go after death is where you came from before life. In this way, birth and death are not beginnings and endings, but doorways, thresholds into and out of the same mystery. These visions are not only metaphysical, they are deeply psychological. They reveal how humans grapple with the terror of nothingness. To imagine that you were something before birth is to reassure yourself that you will be something after death. To imagine that your soul has existed forever is to resist the possibility of total erasure. Even in traditions that reject pre-birth, the denial itself is a way of dealing with the abyss. Taken together, these mythologies and spiritual teachings form a vast mosaic. Some say you were pure essence, others say you were a soul waiting. Others say you were simply nothing until God created you. Some say you were many lives before. Others say you have always been and always will be. What unites them all is a refusal to accept the idea of a meaningless void. The human imagination fills the silence with patterns, with stories, with cycles, with realms. And maybe this tells us something profound. The question itself may be unanswerable, but it is also universal. Every culture has asked it. Every religion has woven a story around it. The silence before birth is a canvas upon which humanity paints meaning. Whether you accept reincarnation, eternal essence, divine creation, or pure nothingness, your answer is part of this long human struggle with mystery. When we wonder what we were before birth, we immediately run into a strange problem. Our brains cannot easily imagine non-existence. Try for a moment to picture what it was like before you were born. Almost instantly, the mind runs into a blank wall. You might imagine darkness, but darkness is still a thing you're picturing. You might imagine silence, but silence is still an experience. To imagine nothingness is paradoxical, because to imagine it, you must fill it with something. And yet before birth, you are not experiencing, not perceiving, not thinking, at least in the way we normally understand consciousness. This puzzle of how to represent nothing lies at the heart of our difficulty with the question. Psychologists have studied how people conceptualize pre-birth existence. Interestingly, many of the same themes appear cross-culturally. When asked what it was like before they were born, children often say things like, "I was sleeping," or "I was waiting," or "I was watching from the sky." Adults sometimes describe it as being in a void, or with God, or just not existing. What's striking is that even when people say they believe in absolute nothingness, they still usually frame it in terms of something: darkness, stillness, emptiness. The human brain seems almost incapable of fully representing true absence. Cognitive science offers some insight into why. Our brains evolved to predict, to simulate, to imagine possibilities. Everything in our experience is built from patterns of sensory input. Even when you close your eyes and imagine blackness, your brain is still generating a visual representation. To think of before birth is to reach for a category outside of experience. And since your brain only knows experience, it fills the gap with metaphors. That's why so many descriptions of pre-birth sound like metaphors. Sleep, waiting, shadows, clouds. They are our best attempts to describe what is fundamentally indescribable. Neuroscience also forces us to question what you really means. You are not a single thing inside your skull. Consciousness arises from a vast web of neural interactions. The default mode network, for example, creates the sense of self, the autobiographical narrative that feels like you. But this system doesn't exist until the brain develops. A fetus in early development does not yet have the neural architecture for memory, language, or self-awareness. In that sense, before your brain reached a certain threshold, there was no you to speak of. The raw biological materials existed, cells dividing, genes unfolding, but the subjective self was not there. Neuroscience would argue, before birth, you were the potential for a mind, not a mind itself. Yet this raises a deeper question. Is consciousness simply the product of brain activity, or is the brain more like a receiver of something larger? This debate has raged for centuries. The standard materialist view says consciousness emerges from complexity. Just as wetness emerges from molecules of water, consciousness emerges from neural networks firing in vast patterns. In this view, before your brain formed, there was no consciousness. You simply didn't exist. Consciousness began when your brain was sufficiently developed to support it, and it will end when your brain ceases functioning. But there are other perspectives. Some philosophers and scientists propose that consciousness might be more fundamental than matter. According to theories like panpsychism, consciousness is not something that appears at a certain level of complexity, but something that is woven into the very fabric of reality. Every particle, every field, every interaction contains some tiny spark of experience, however primitive. In this view, what you were before birth was not nothing. You were already part of the field of consciousness that pervades the universe. Birth did not create your awareness. It localized it, gave it form, gave it the boundaries of a brain and body. This idea overlaps with some interpretations of quantum theory. Certain physicists and philosophers suggest that the quantum field may not just describe probabilities of particles, but may be related to consciousness itself. The mind might not be an accidental byproduct of matter, but an expression of a deeper order of reality. If that's the case, then before you were born, you were not absent. You were diffuse, spread throughout the fabric of reality, awaiting the moment when biology would focus you into a personal perspective. Another perspective comes from the study of near-death experiences, NDRs. Many people who report NDEs describe a sense of returning, of merging into something that feels eternal. Whether or not these experiences are neurochemical illusions, they raise a provocative symmetry. If death feels like returning, perhaps birth feels like leaving. Before you were born, you may have been immersed in something larger, something formless, just as some people describe after nearly dying. Psychology also explores the existential weight of imagining pre-birth nothingness. Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously pointed out that death troubles us because we compare it to life. We think of not existing as a deprivation, but before we were born, we didn't exist either, and that doesn't trouble us in the same way. The symmetry problem, Why do we fear the non-existence after life but not the non-existence before life? Forces us to confront our biases. Perhaps we should regard both as the same, or perhaps our intuition that they are different hints at something deeper, something hidden. Developmental psychology adds another layer. Infants do not begin life with a sense of self. For the first months, their experiences are raw, undifferentiated sensations. The sense of being an I gradually emerges as the brain develops. In a sense, you were born twice. First physically, then psychologically, as consciousness learns to recognize itself. Before that, you were not the you know now, even if your body existed. This complicates the idea of pre-birth existence. If the self is something that emerges slowly, then what you were before birth depends on where you draw the line between being alive and being aware. Some neuroscientists go even further and suggest that consciousness might not be binary but graded. Instead of suddenly switching on, it may exist in degrees. A fetus in late gestation might experience something like dreamlike sensations, a diffuse form of awareness without selfhood. If that's true, then before you were born, you may have had glimmers of experience, floating in warmth, hearing muffled sounds, feeling rhythms of the mother's heartbeat. You were not fully conscious, not self-aware, but you were not nothing either. Your pre-birth state may have been a twilight consciousness, a kind of proto-awareness. And then there is memory, or rather its absence. Because you cannot remember anything before birth, your brain treats it as non-existence. But absence of memory is not the same as absence of being. Think about sleep. Every night you spend hours in dreamless sleep where you remember nothing, yet you still exist in those hours. If someone asked you to imagine what it's like to not exist during sleep, you couldn't, but you accept that those hours passed. Similarly, just because you cannot remember anything before birth doesn't prove that nothing happened. It only proves that the self you identify with has no access to those states. This leads into one of the most provocative scientific questions. Is consciousness local or non-local? Local theories say it is entirely generated by the brain. Non-local theories suggest the brain is more like a receiver, tuning into a wider field. If the latter is true, then what you were before birth is still here now. The field, the universal consciousness. But you had not yet tuned into it. Birth was like switching on the radio, focusing the broadcast into a channel. Before that, you were still part of the signal, but without the receiver, you had no voice. Philosophy of mind offers yet another angle. Some thinkers argue that consciousness is not about existence, but about perspective. Before birth, you did not have a perspective. The universe still existed, perhaps even consciousness existed, but there was no vantage point called you. When you were born, a perspective opened, a window through which the cosmos could look at itself. Before that, there was no window. You weren't absent, but you weren't individuated. You were reality without a viewpoint. Ultimately, psychology and neuroscience both push us toward humility. They show that our categories, existence and non-existence, consciousness and unconsciousness, may not be as absolute as they seem. They are gradients, processes, perspectives. What you were before birth may not fit neatly into something or nothing. It may be more accurate to say you were a potential, a becoming, a process in motion. You were the conditions for consciousness before consciousness, the possibility before the realization. And this recognition itself is profound. It suggests that the question, what was I before I was born, might not have a single answer. Scientifically, you were cells dividing, DNA unfolding, a nervous system growing toward awareness. Psychologically, you were potential consciousness, a mind not yet awake. Philosophically, you were part of the larger field of being, waiting to open a window onto the world. And experientially, you were nothing you can remember, because memory, selfhood, and identity had not yet begun. One of the most striking things about contemplating where you were before birth is how quickly it leads to questions about meaning. If there was nothing before you, and if there will be nothing after you, then what does it mean to exist at all? For some, this realization can feel bleak, a reminder of impermanence. But for others, it is liberating, a call to make the most of the fleeting window of awareness you've been given. The nothingness before birth can be seen as either an abyss or a canvas. How you interpret it depends on how you see yourself and the world. Philosophers have long wrestled with this. Jean-Paul Sartre and other existentialists argued that life begins with nothingness, and that it is up to us to create meaning. Since there was no purpose inscribed before you were born, no preordained script waiting for you, you are free, but also burdened with the responsibility of shaping your own existence. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying. It means you are not simply a passenger carried along by destiny. You are the author of your own story, writing on the blank page that nothingness handed you. But what does it mean to create meaning out of nothing? One way to understand it is through creativity. Before you were born, there was no art you had made, no words you had spoken, no mark you had left. After birth, each action, each thought, is a brushstroke on the canvas of being. From nothing, you create something, whether it is a friendship, a work of art, or even just a fleeting smile. In this sense, your entire life is an act of creation, a transformation of absence into presence. This perspective also highlights how fragile and precious identity is. Think about the specific chain of events that led to you existing at all. A different choice, a different moment, and you would never have appeared. You are not inevitable. You are an improbable accident of time and matter. And yet once you exist, the story of you becomes real. It shapes the world around you, influences others, and becomes part of the human narrative. Nothingness gives way to somethingness, and that shift is profound. The strangeness of pre-birth nothingness also invites comparison with sleep and unconsciousness. Every night, when you drift into deep sleep, your awareness dissolves. Hours pass without your noticing. Then you awaken, and the story continues. This cycle is not identical to the nothingness before birth, but it is a glimpse of what absence feels like. You cannot remember the moments before you awoke as a newborn, just as you cannot remember the hours you spend in dreamless sleep. Awareness is fragile, easily extinguished and reignited. The nothingness before birth is simply the longest stretch of absence you will never recall. But here's the paradox. Even though you cannot recall that nothingness, you can think about it. That alone shows the power of human consciousness. Out of nothing came a being capable of asking why it was nothing in the first place. The universe produced a creature that could look back into the abyss and wonder. This act of wondering may be one of the most profound things consciousness can do. This is also where science and philosophy intertwine. From a scientific perspective, you are an arrangement of atoms briefly assembled into awareness. From a philosophical perspective, that awareness is a mystery that illuminates the void around it. Before you, there was no observer asking questions. After you, there will be none again. But while you are here, you shine light into the darkness, however briefly. This realization can inspire humility. If before birth you were nothing and after death you may be nothing again, then the self is not a permanent structure. It is more like a wave rising and falling in the ocean. The ocean was there before you. It will be there after you. You are the temporary crest, beautiful for a moment, then gone. Yet the ocean never ceases. The atoms that make you will return to the cosmos. The energy that fueled your thoughts will disperse, but not vanish. In this sense, nothingness is never absolute. It is simply the absence of form, waiting to take shape again. Another way to approach pre-birth nothingness is through the lens of identity. You often think of yourself as continuous, a single, unbroken line stretching from birth to now. But if you step back, that line is fragile. Your memories only reach back so far. Before that, the self dissolves. The you of today is not the same as the you of yesterday, or of childhood, or of infancy. Your identity is constantly shifting, adapting, reinventing itself. The nothingness before birth may simply be the farthest edge of this shifting process, a boundary where memory and self finally disappear into silence. Some spiritual traditions take this further, suggesting that the nothingness before birth is not truly empty, but full. In certain Eastern philosophies, the void is seen not as absence, but as a fertile ground from which all things arise. Before you, there was emptiness, but that emptiness contained infinite potential. To exist is to crystallize one thread of that potential into form. From this perspective, pre-birth nothingness is not a loss, but a gift. It is the womb of possibility, the silent field from which consciousness blooms. Science, of course, tends to remain cautious about such claims. But even within a scientific framework, the idea of potential resonates. Before you were born, countless possibilities existed. Only one became you. That alone shows that nothingness is not as simple as it seems. It is not just blankness. It is a field of contingencies, a web of probabilities, waiting for the right conditions to ignite. This interplay between nothingness and being also raises questions about memory and legacy. You cannot remember the nothingness before birth, but others will remember you after you are gone. In that sense, the line between nothing and something is not just about consciousness, but about connection. You emerged from silence, but once you exist, you affect others. You become part of their memories, part of their stories. Even if you return to nothingness, the ripples you created will continue to move outward. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of contemplating the nothing before birth. It reminds you that existence is not solitary. It is woven into a vast tapestry of time, matter, and experience. You are not separate from the universe. You are one of its temporary expressions. Before birth, the universe was silent of you. After birth, the universe contained you. After death, the universe will move on, but it will still bear the trace of your presence. To hold this perspective is to feel both small and immense at once. Small, because you are brief. Immense, because you are real. The nothingness before birth makes your being all the more miraculous. Out of infinite possibilities, out of silence, out of the void itself, you appeared. Hello again, and welcome to the final stretch of our exploration. We've wandered through deep questions, through science, philosophy, and imagination, all circling around the mystery of where you were before you were born. We've looked at nothingness not as a void of despair, but as a place of potential, of silence, of possibility. It is where you came from, and it may be where you return. But in between, here you are, alive, aware, breathing in this fleeting moment of existence. What makes this contemplation so moving is how it reveals the fragility of being. You did not exist for billions of years, and then, suddenly, you appeared. You might only be here for a handful of decades, and then you may disappear again. Yet during that time, you experienced laughter, love, curiosity, and wonder. You think about stars and galaxies. You imagine what came before you, even though you cannot remember it. That alone is extraordinary. Out of silence, you became a voice asking about silence. Out of nothing, you became something capable of recognizing nothing. There is a paradox here worth holding on to. The nothingness before you is unknowable, yet it has shaped you. It is the contrast that makes existence vivid. Just as a painting needs a background to highlight its figures, your life stands out against the backdrop of absence. The fact that there was a time without you gives your presence a kind of brilliance, like a flame in the darkness. The silence before birth makes the music of life more profound. Think of the universe as a grand symphony. For most of its history, your particular melody was not playing. Then, for a short span, your notes began. They interweave with others, harmonizing, clashing, resonating. Then one day, your melody will quiet, but the music continues. The silence before you and after you frames your part, but it doesn't erase it. The sound you've made is real, and once it exists, it cannot be undone. When you reflect on this, it can bring both humility and gratitude. To be alive at all, to exist after nothingness, is an improbable gift. Every conversation you have, every thought you think, every simple act of being is part of that gift. Perhaps this is why so many traditions urge us to treat life as precious. Whether or not you believe in an afterlife or in cycles of rebirth, the life you have now is unrepeatable. This moment, right now, is unique in all of history. It's worth remembering too that even though you cannot recall the nothingness before your birth, you were never truly separate from the universe. The atoms that form you have always existed, scattered across stars and galaxies, waiting to gather into your form. The energy that animates you has flowed through countless transformations: sunlight into food, food into thought, thought into action. In this sense, you are not new. You are ancient matter rearranged, eternal energy reshaped. What is new is the consciousness, the awareness, the fragile flame that allows you to ask, where was I before I began? That question itself is a marvel. It shows the depth of your mind, the way it reaches beyond survival into wonder. To ponder pre-birth nothingness is to stretch consciousness to its limits, to press against the edges of what it can imagine. In doing so, you glimpse not only the mystery of beginnings, but also the mystery of existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we emerge from silence at all? These questions may never have final answers, but they open us into awe. And sometimes awe is more powerful than certainty. As we come to the end of this journey, think about how this reflection sits within you. Perhaps it brings peace, knowing that before birth there was no suffering, no pain, no worry. Perhaps it brings a sense of urgency, reminding you to savor the time you do have. Or perhaps it simply leaves you in quiet wonder, marveling at the strangeness of being something rather than nothing. Whatever you feel, let it settle softly within you. And now, as you prepare to drift into sleep, let these thoughts dissolve into calm. You don't need to solve the mystery tonight. You don't need to hold on to every question. Just allow yourself to rest in the knowledge that you are here for this brief and luminous moment, surrounded by the vastness of the universe. You came from silence, and one day you will return to silence. But tonight, you are present. You are real. You are alive. Let that truth be enough as you close your eyes and let sleep carry you gently into the quiet, timeless space from which you came.